There is a moment at dawn on October 7th, 1571, in the Gulf of Patras off the western coast of Greece, when two fleets so vast that contemporary observers struggled to find adequate language for their scale moved toward each other across water so still and so luminously blue that sailors on both sides later described the morning as almost impossibly beautiful. A beauty that made what was about to happen feel like a desecration of something the world had not consented to sacrifice. And the numbers alone should stop you breathing for a moment, because what was assembling in that Ionian water was the largest concentration of naval military power the Mediterranean world had ever witnessed. In a single engagement, more than 400 warships, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 men packed into galleys so overcrowded that the rowers were chained to their benches not only to prevent escape, but because there was literally nowhere else for them to go, and at the center of the Ottoman fleet, flying the great green standard of the caliphate, was Ali Pasha. The Caputan Pasha, or Grand Admiral, a man who had been given command of the most powerful naval force in the world, and who carried on his flagship a banner said to contain the name of Allah inscribed 49,000 times, and facing him across that blue and treacherous water was Don John of Austria, 24 years old, illegitimate son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a young man so boyishly handsome that contemporaries on both sides noted his appearance commanding a coalition fleet that had been assembled through a diplomatic miracle of competing Catholic interests that should, by every measure of European great power, politics have collapsed before it ever left harbor. And what these two men and these two fleets were about to do to each other in the next 4 hours would generate a myth so enormous and so politically useful to so many different agendas simultaneously that the actual battle, the specific physical and human reality of what happened in that water, has been almost entirely consumed by the story that the survivors and their descendants needed it to be the Holy League that assembled at Lepanto was not born from unity, but from the specific quality of desperation that makes historical enemies temporarily forget why they hate each other, because the powers that contributed ships and men and money to Don John's fleet, the Papacy under Pius V, the Republic of Venice, the Spanish Empire under Philip II, the Genoese, the Knights of Malta, had spent the preceding decades competing, feuding, and occasionally fighting each other with an enthusiasm that made the Ottoman threat feel almost secondary by comparison, and what forced them into the same harbor was a sequence of Ottoman naval victories so comprehensive and so strategically consequential that the Christian maritime powers of the Mediterranean faced the genuine possibility of losing effective control of the sea that had defined their commerce and their power for millennia, the fall of Cyprus to the Ottomans in 1570 and 1571, the island that Venice had held for 80 years and whose loss was conducted with a brutality that shocked even a century accustomed to brutality, including the flaying alive of the Venetian commander Marcantonio Bragadin, whose stuffed skin was paraded through the streets of Famagusta, had produced in Venice a combination of grief and fury that temporarily overrode the republics. Traditional calculation that trade with the Ottoman Empire was worth more than war against it, and the man who assembled the coalition against this backdrop was not Don John, but Pius V, a Dominican friar who had become pope and who drove the alliance with a theological intensity that his political partners found simultaneously inspiring and exhausting, and the specific composition of the fleet that resulted from his diplomatic labor was itself a map of the contradictions at the heart of the enterprise. Spanish tercios and Venetian sailors and Genoese mercenaries and papal troops who had never been to sea, commanded by a 24-year-old with no significant naval experience, opposing an Ottoman fleet commanded by veterans of the Mediterranean who had spent their careers mastering. Exactly this kind of engagement what happened between approximately 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. On October 7, 1571, was a violence so total and so compressed that the Gulf of Patras was stained red for days afterward, and the bodies of the dead floated in such numbers that ships could not move through the water without pushing them aside. And the tactical turning point came not from the celebrated heroism of Don John's flagship engaging Ali Pasha's in the center, though that engagement was real and decisive, but from a decision made in the weeks before the battle by a Venetian engineer named Fausto, who had designed 6 enormous galleasses, hybrid vessels, far larger than any conventional galley floating artillery platforms, so heavy with cannon that when the Ottoman fleet saw them for the first time, it had no tactical framework for understanding what they were, and the galleasses were towed into position ahead of the Christian line, and when the Ottoman galleys swept forward in their traditional formation expecting to grapple and board and fight the hand-to-hand infantry battle at which their janissaries excelled, they ran into something they had never encountered, massed artillery fire from vessels, so large they could not easily be sunk by ramming, and the formation broke in the chaos of that breaking. Don John's fleet closed, and the fighting became so intimate that men on opposing galleys were killing each other with oars and bare hands, and Ali Pasha died on his flagship, his head raised, on a pike. And when the Ottoman sailors saw it, the resistance that remained collapsed into something closer to massacre than battle, and within 4 hours of the first shot, the Ottoman fleet had lost perhaps 210 galleys, sunk or captured, and perhaps 30,000 men dead, and 15,000 Christian galley slaves freed from their oars, and the Christian fleet had lost perhaps 13 galleys and 8,000 men, and the Mediterranean had changed, and the question of how much it had changed would occupy historians for the next 4.5 centuries here, is where the history insists on its complications, because the myth of Lepanto as a civilizational turning point, the moment when Christian Europe broke Ottoman naval supremacy forever and secured the Mediterranean against Islamic domination, is a myth that the subsequent historical record refuses to fully support. And the refusal is instructive because within a year of Lepanto, the Ottoman Empire had rebuilt its fleet, launching 150 new galleys in a construction effort of such staggering industrial organization that the Venetian ambassador in Constantinople reported it with undisguised astonishment. And the new fleet sailed in 1572 under Uluj Ali, the Calabrian-born former Christian slave who had converted to Islam and risen to become the only Ottoman commander to escape Lepanto with his forces intact. And Venice, which had borne the largest share of the naval burden at Lepanto, looked at that rebuilt Ottoman fleet and made the calculation that it had always made when military reality collided with commercial necessity. It signed a separate peace with the Ottomans in 1573, surrendering Cyprus, entirely the island, whose threatened loss had driven it into the Holy League in the first place, paying a substantial indemnity and resuming the trading relationship that its economy depended upon, a decision that Philip II of Spain regarded as a betrayal of everything Lepanto had meant, and that Venice regarded as the entirely rational behavior of a mercantile republic that had never confused religious symbolism with strategic interest. And then there are the galley slaves, the 15,000 Christian rowers freed from Ottoman benches in the aftermath of the battle, a liberation that the triumphalist narrative celebrates, whose existence as slaves in the first place. It tends not to examine because the Holy League fleet that won at Lepanto was itself powered in significant part by enslaved rowers, condemned criminals and Muslim prisoners, and men taken in raids on North African coastlines, chained to their benches on the winning side, just as Christians had been chained on the losing one. A symmetry that the mythology of the Christian victory at Lepanto has never known what to do with, and has therefore chosen consistently and deliberately to ignore Lepanto lives in the modern world as a symbol that has been claimed, weaponized, emptied of historical content, and refilled with contemporary ideological cargo so many times that recovering the actual event from beneath the accumulated myth requires a kind of archaeological patience that politics rarely permits. And the battle was real, and its tactical dimensions were extraordinary. And the human cost on both sides was genuinely catastrophic in ways that the triumphalist tradition aestheticizes and the counter-tradition minimizes, and neither tradition fully confronts with the honesty that the dead deserve. And what Lepanto actually demonstrated was not the permanent superiority of one civilization over another, but something considerably more modest and considerably more interesting. It demonstrated that the Ottoman naval system, which had dominated Mediterranean warfare for decades through tactical flexibility and institutional efficiency, had encountered a specific technological and tactical problem in the form of the galleasses, for which it had no immediate answer, and that problems without immediate answers in military competition tend to produce rapid adaptation rather than permanent defeat, as the rebuilt Ottoman fleet of 1572 illustrated with brutal clarity in the Mediterranean that emerged from the decade of the 1570s was not a Christian lake or an Ottoman lake, but the same contested and commercially indispensable body of water. It had always been navigated by merchants and pirates and diplomats of every faith and political configuration in arrangements of shifting pragmatism that the clean ideological lines of the Lepanto myth were never designed to describe. And today, when Lepanto surfaces in political discourse, it almost invariably surfaces as a symbol of civilizational conflict, invoked by people who need history to confirm that the world has always been divided along the lines they have already drawn, and the question that the blue water of the Gulf of Patras is still asking, that the chained rowers on both sides of that engagement are still asking. From whatever silence follows, a life lived at the end of someone else's, or is whether we are capable of looking at a moment of genuine historical complexity and resisting the temptation to flatten it into the shape of the argument we already wanted to make. And what it says about us that after 4.5 centuries, we still cannot quite manage it.